Rusia și China sunt doi actori influenți, dar foarte diferiți, deși par să aibă multe în comun. De aceea și raportarea noastră la cele două state trebuie să fie diferită. După ce rușii au anexat ilegal Crimeea în 2014, reacția vestului a fost mai degrabă moderată, deși avertismentele pe care le dădeau democrațiile estice erau serioase. Abia reluarea ostilităților împotriva Ucrainei a modificat atitudinea lumii în fața Moscovei. China, la rândul ei, își arată multiplele fațete, dar are alte abordări în relațiile externe, iar acest lucru trebuie bine înțeles. Simon Coveney, ministrul de externe, dar și ministrul apărării din Irlanda, este invitatul meu de astăzi și discutăm împreună despre schimbările pe care le trăim toți. Sunt Cristina Cileacu, începe Pașaport diplomatic. Simon Coveney, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defence of Ireland, welcome to Diplomatic Passport.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be here.
Well, Russian war in Ukraine affected all of us. What is the impact of this war when it comes to your country?
Well, first of all, I think we can see that the Russian aggression in Ukraine, the illegality of this war is changing the security architecture of the continent of Europe. I never thought in my lifetime that I would be talking about a whole-scale war on our continent again, which has driven, more than 7 million people out of Ukraine into the EU. I never thought I would be in Kyiv standing at the edge of a mass grave. I was the first foreign minister actually to visit Kyiv, and there were at that time 503 bodies in mass graves in Bucha, just outside Kyiv. The Irish people want to be part of the solidarity in terms of how we respond to that. We want to support countries like Romania and other countries that are really at the coalface, if you like, of this conflict, bordering Ukraine, and of course bordering the Black Sea as well, and helping a very vulnerable country like Moldova trying to deal with the consequences of what's happening. So from our perspective, we have contributed to all of the efforts that are collective within the European Union. Military assistance to Ukraine. So far, Ireland has committed about 55 million euros through the European Peace Facility. Humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. So far, we've contributed about 30 million euros, some of that money directly to Moldova. We have been very much at the sharp end of the debate on sanctions. What I mean by that is that Ireland's view is that the sanctions should be as tough as possible in an effort to act as a deterrent to the Kremlin in terms of continuing this war and this aggression. And by the way, that includes gas and oil. We believe that Russia needs to be isolated and that the EU needs to send a very strong and powerful message that what is happening in Ukraine, what's happening on our continent at the moment is not acceptable, and there needs to be a very significant economic cost for Russia to continuing that war. And of course then on refugees, which is really the face of this war that we see. So far about 42,000 Ukrainians have come to Ireland. We have no visa system, no quota system. Any Ukrainian who wants to come to Ireland seeking refuge and safety is welcome, and we will do everything we can to make sure that they are supported and protected, both financially, from a housing perspective, from education and healthcare. Effectively, we treat Ukrainians like they're
Irish.
Like they're Irish, members of the EU, like they're Romanian. And I know you're doing the same here. I think that countries like Romania, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, in many ways they've done an incredible job because, as you know here, one of the most divisive debates politically within the European Union has been migration. And I think this war has really changed that debate very fundamentally, where in many ways countries on the eastern borders of the EU feel that they're part of this war in terms of a war effort around supporting the responding to the extraordinary human tragedy that we're seeing because of the scale of this conflict, and how, of course, Russia have been deliberately targeting civilians, women, children, schools, hospitals, apartment complexes.
And continues to do it.
Continues to do it. I mean, these are war crimes, by any measure. They are absolutely illegal. They're breaking all of the conventions of war that Russia has signed up to, and they're doing it brazenly in the heart of Europe, where everybody can see it. So, this sends a signal, I think, to the EU and in many ways to its allies, that this war is changing permanently, at least while President Putin is in control in Russia, changing permanently the relationship between the EU and Russia, and not for the better, I'm afraid.
We'll talk about that, but first I want to ask you about the declaration that the Russian ambassador in Dublin had recently, saying that the West, including Ireland, is guilty for what is happening in Ukraine. Are this type of blaming the other for your own aggression still works?
Not in Ireland. I mean, this is disinformation. I mean, let's call it what it is, and it's just not true. The idea that somehow NATO, and Ireland is not a member of NATO. We have partnered with NATO at different times, but we're not a member. But the idea that NATO is responsible for this war is just crazy talk. I mean, NATO is a defense alliance. If you ask a country like Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia, if you ask Sweden or Finland, why are they now applying to join NATO? It's not because they want to threaten Russia. It's because they want to protect themselves from Russian aggression. Yeah,
but this is clear for a country like ours. It's not clear for any other partners that Russia might have.
True. And that is true. And Russia has been quite successful, actually, in other parts of the world. Latin America, Africa, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa.
Middle East.
Middle East.
Even Asia.
Yeah. And, Russia is a very influential country in the world. Russia is involved in the security of many countries. Russia is involved in supplying oil and gas to many countries in the world. So they're using all of that influence, and they are also very effective at, disinformation campaigns, and using all of the modern platforms to do that. And basically their argument is that this is a war that has happened because of a sort of a seeping Western influence into Ukraine, looking to try to threaten Russia by moving into its sphere of influence. I just think that is not a reflection of reality, but it is also something that they have successfully managed to do in many countries. And the European Union needs to be more effective and needs to be more proactive at actually getting its message across, because the European Union is a diplomatic superpower. It is an economic superpower. We have reach into every country in the world. And we need to get better at our communication strategy in terms of telling the truth here, because the most important battle in many ways is the battle for the truth in terms of democracy, the rule of law, and who is at fault here for global food insecurity, for dramatic inflation in terms of the cost of living, for supply shortages in terms of oil and gas. This is all because of Russian aggression, and that is a message that I think the EU needs to become more effective at getting across in terms of global debates. Now, we have been quite successful. I mean, let's not be too critical. I think most of the world understands what's happening here, but of course, countries will get fatigued over time, and they will be focused on their own concerns and their own people. If you're a country, if you're Somalia, or if you're Egypt, or if you're Lebanon, and you import very large volumes of grain from Ukraine and you can't get it right now, or you can't get it without spending an extra 50 or 60%, which you can't afford, well then you're less concerned about what's causing this and more concerned about ending the problem. And in some parts of the world, the blame has been on Russia and the EU, as if we're all equally at fault for this conflict, which of course isn't true.
And since you mentioned the relationship, the long-term relationship that the European Union must have with Russia, how would this relationship look like?
Well, look, I mean, everybody wants, I mean, certainly from an Irish point of view, we want a closer relationship with Russia. We want the EU and Russia to be able to work together, trade together.
Can Russia be trusted with or without Putin? Because this is a question mark as well.
I think we'll have to wait and see what happens post-Putin. But that seems like a long way off right now. I think instead what the European Union is now preparing for is a long war of attrition. And we have to show stamina through that. We have to show solidarity through that process. We can't abandon Ukraine. Ukrainians are giving their lives by the hundred in order to try to protect a future way of life for their children, which is based on EU values and democratic systems and a respect for the rule of law. And for the European Court of Human Rights. That is a journey that many in Ukraine are willing to give their lives to achieve. And we need to respect that, and we need to support them. In many ways, it's not an anti-Russia thing, it's a pro-Ukraine issue. And to support Ukraine in terms of protecting themselves from Russian aggression, and of course to support Ukraine's pathway to EU membership. But this is also a moment in history when the European Union is being tested in a way that it has not been tested before, and it needs to respond. You know, this is our project, first and foremost, is a peace project. You know, it's about values, it's about stability and peace, it's about allowing people to raise their families in functioning democracies that support them. And Russia is challenging all of that through their actions in Ukraine. And that's why I think the response here in Romania, but also in other countries that understand Russia perhaps better than we do in Ireland, has been so strong. And in some ways, it's changing how the European Union functions. So there's been a shift of influence in the European Union east towards the countries that perhaps understand Russia the most, in terms of actually taking their advice on how to proceed, which is a change, because Romania and many of the Baltic states and Poland have been talking about the threat of Russia for many years. I'm not sure it was taken as seriously as it should have been.
Doesn't look like.
From other countries in the European Union who had a different relationship with Russia, which was less threatened. So I think all of that dynamic is changing right now, and unfortunately it's taken this war to bring the EU together in a security and defence perspective in a way that certainly I've never seen before. And even a country like Ireland, you know, Ireland is not a member of NATO. We don't have any natural enemies. We're militarily neutral historically and continue to be today. You know, even last week as a defence minister, I brought a proposal to my government to increase defence spending significantly over the next 6 years by about 80%, to increase our troop numbers by 35% in that period. So, you know, every country in the European Union is now thinking differently about their own security and, of course, the relationships with other EU countries, which I think is going to be much more based on partnership now rather than isolation.
If Putin will take a break, let's say, from the war, if he takes fully Donetsk and Luhansk, shall we say, is the end of the war? Because we have the example of Crimea. And you mentioned the eastern state, all of them said that it's not okay, we should do something. We didn't do something, and now we have this.
We did do something, but not enough. And I think the lesson, and certainly the countries that know Russia best, are saying to me that if Russia militarily takes Donbass, parts of southern Ukraine, and of course holds on to Crimea, and then stops their military advance there, should and can we accept that? And my answer to that is we should only accept what Ukraine can accept. So we should be guided by what Ukraine and its government and its president want. And of course the fear is that Russia won't stop there, that actually they'll make gains, they'll then pause to effectively rebuild their forces, and then they'll go again in a few years' time. And that's the big fear. And that's why the outcome of this war is so uncertain, because there is no appetite on either side for the war to end anytime soon. Ukraine is convinced that with Western support, which they're getting in very strong terms, that they can push Russia back out of eastern Ukraine. And of course Russia is saying that this military operation won't end until they control eastern Ukraine. This is a very difficult war to predict an outcome. And so from an Irish perspective, we will do everything we can to support the Ukrainian side, and we will be guided by what Ukraine wants and asks for in the context of how and when and if this war ends in the future. And I think we owe them that solidarity, given the extraordinary sacrifice that Ukrainians are making at the moment in terms of loss of life.
Another threat that is also mentioned in the NATO final conclusion of this recent summit is, of course, China. And if we look at the recent visit of Joe Biden in the Middle East, for instance, we can say that he didn't obtain much. Middle East looks to be under the influence of China more than under the influence of the West. Is this a trend, or can the West win back some of these parts of the world that are now taken discreetly but taken by China?
First of all, I think it would be a mistake to allow the global debates on these issues to become simplified and polarized. And what I mean by that is that some people will say to you, this essentially is about democracies versus autocracies, and all democracies should work together in the face of all autocracies. I also think it's a very dangerous strategy, because of course there are very powerful democracies in the world, and and the EU and the US are getting closer together because of Russian aggression and because of concerns with China and so on. But I think that the West and the EU should treat China and Russia very differently. Otherwise we'll drive them together, and I think that would be a huge mistake. China needs the economic opportunities that come from a relationship with the EU and the US and other Western democracies. And so, while of course we need to have an honest conversation with China about the concerns that we have on human rights, on regulation, on fair competition in terms of global trade, and of course on a growing military influence on the world that comes from China. We also, I think, need to have a relationship with China in the context of that global power balance, if you like. Whereas I think some people perhaps are too quick to push China into the same category as Russia in terms of an aggressor or competition for the West. So I think that they're two very different countries. That they both have significant influence in the world in different ways and for different reasons. I think China is very uncomfortable with what Russia is currently doing in Ukraine. They haven't said very much publicly, but I think they are very uncomfortable with the instability that is creating. So in many ways, I think we need to work to keep Russia and China apart rather than actually force them together. So that it's not easy to do that. because I know if you travel to Washington, they will see China as their medium-term strategic competitor in the world, not Russia actually. They see Russia as a short-term military challenge in terms of Ukraine. So I just think there are no easy answers to that question. I think we need to respond to both Russian and Chinese leadership on the basis of their behavior. And I think our guiding principles have got to be international law, human rights, and the promotion of democracy. And if we're consistent on those three key principles, both with China and with Russia, then I think we can manage the relationship with China. And in the short term, of course, we have to try to counteract Russian aggression in the context of supporting Ukraine and, of course, keeping the solidarity within the European Union and the transatlantic relationship intact. Because it's, in many ways, the calculation of President Putin with this war was that he would divide the EU. He saw the US as weak at the moment. Many of his calculations have been proven to be wrong, but that doesn't mean that we should underestimate Russia in terms of their capacity for a war of attrition here for a very long time and the hardship that that will bring. And I think there is a calculation in Russia that they have more capacity for hardship over a longer period of time than perhaps the European Union has. And that if this war continues, that they will see solidarity in the European Union fracture. And we have to make sure that that does not happen. And I think that is the core test for the European Union in the months ahead.
Minister, thank you so much for this very Irish perspective of the situation of the world right now.
Thank you. Anytime.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina de Facebook a emisiunii și pe contul nostru de Twitter. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe, vinerea viitoare de la 11:30 și reluare sâmbătă după miezul nopții. La revedere!